My name is Brynlee Townsend. I'm 41 years old, and I live in Kansas City, Missouri. When people look at me today, they probably just see an ordinary woman. But inside, I carry a story that shaped me, broke me, and rebuilt me. I've been silence. I've been a muffled scream. I was the kind of person who cried in the bathroom so no one would hear. But through every season, God was there, even when I thought he had turned his face away. This is one of those stories of overcoming with God that you won't find in any self-help book. For a long time, I didn't even feel worthy to pray. You know that feeling of carrying something so heavy that even faith feels out of reach? That's exactly how I felt. And the strange thing is, even without realizing it, I was being held together by this invisible thread called hope. A hope that rose from the ashes, fed by one single truth. God was still listening, even when I couldn't find the words. This is the kind of testimony only people who've walked through the wilderness will understand. And before you assume this is just another feel-good story with a happy ending, it's not about that. It's about real pain, hard choices, years of silence, and a prayer that felt like it got lost in time. I often say my life wasn't interrupted, it was rerouted. And it was right there, at that unexpected turn where everything truly began. A turn that led me to make a heartbreaking decision. One you'll understand better in the next chapter. I was 21 when the news hit me like a storm out of a clear blue sky. That positive test stared back at me like it already knew what was about to happen in my life. I wasn't ready. And honestly, I don't think anyone ever really is. It felt like everything I knew just vanished into thin air. And in the middle of all that confusion, a heavy silence settled in my chest. That was the moment my journey of overcoming with God began, even though I didn't realize it at the time. You know what hurt the most? It wasn't the fear of the future. It was the fear of going through it alone. My mind was spinning with questions I couldn't answer. How am I going to tell my mom? What will people at church think? What if no one wants me after this? The truth is, back then, I thought God was disappointed in me. I thought he had ended my story. Little did I know, he was just picking up a new pen and writing a brand new page with his own hands. I still remember those nights, staring at the ceiling, not sure whether to cry or scream. I can't explain it, but somehow, something inside me kept standing. Maybe it was love already starting to grow, even in the middle of fear. Maybe it was God's strength, even if I didn't recognize him yet. This kind of testimony, this kind of faith, it doesn't come from comfort. It's born in chaos. And it was right there, in the middle of that chaos, that the next chapter of my story began. And honestly, it was even harder. Telling my mom was, without a doubt, the second blow of that season. The first was the shock of the pregnancy. The second was realizing I'd have to face it all alone. Cheryl, my mom, didn't react with compassion. She didn't yell, but her silence was deafening. In that moment, it felt like I stopped being her daughter and became her shame. It's strange how pain can change form. The rejection didn't come from the outside world. It came from under the same roof that was supposed to protect me. That was the beginning of a long road of overcoming with God. For days, I walked through the house like I was just a guest. She avoided eye contact, and when she did speak, it was always with that tone of disappointment that hurts more than any punishment. My mom wasn't cruel. She was just too fragile to handle my weakness. She had dreams for me. And to her, this pregnancy felt like the end of everything. I tried to understand, but it still hurt. And deep down, part of me started to believe maybe I did deserve it. Maybe God really had turned his face away. That cold, distant home is where I started keeping everything inside. Every tear, every fear, every silent prayer asking God to take me out of there. But he didn't, at least not in the way I expected. Instead, he held me together from the inside out. And honestly, that changed everything later on. Because even when you're in a place where no one embraces you, heaven stays open. I didn't know it at the time, but God was already stitching something together. And those threads started to show more clearly as time passed and my belly grew. Pregnancy was a confusing mix of emotions, constantly at war: love and fear, hope and shame. Every day felt like an internal battle. I'd wake up longing to feel my baby move, and at the same time, terrified of what came next. There were no pictures, no baby shower, no celebration. But there were prayers. So many. Silent, broken, sometimes angry, sometimes tender. It was like my soul was slowly learning that overcoming with God doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes it looks like being on your knees. I spent hours alone in my room, hands on my belly, talking to someone who didn't have a face yet, but already had a name in my heart: Callie. I whispered it quietly, like holding on to that name was the only thing I had to give. My mother never asked. The neighbors pretended not to notice. Nicole, my only friend, did her best to keep me going. And still, for some reason, I felt like that child already knew me. Like God, even in silence, was listening to every tear-soaked whisper into my pillow. Over time, one thought kept echoing louder in my mind. What if I can't give her the life she deserves? That question haunted me every night, not because I didn't love her, but maybe because I loved her too much. Because sometimes love means letting go. And it was in that tension that God began to work something deeper in me, a surrender. A surrender that would come with pain, but also with purpose. And the more that thought grew, the more I knew the hardest day of my life was coming. Some days leave a scar on your soul, the kind you carry forever. The day I gave my daughter away was one of those days. The adoption center room felt cold, even with the sun shining outside. I was shaking on the inside. Signing those papers felt like tearing my heart out with my own hands. But you know what hurt the most? Holding that little girl in my arms and feeling a love so big that it forced me to let her go. That was the deepest part of my journey of overcoming with God, because it wasn't quick and it wasn't heroic. It was broken, slow, human. As I looked at her one last time, time seemed to stop. I tried to memorize every detail of her face, every little breath. I wondered if she'd recognize me someday, if she'd have my eyes, if she'd ever hear the songs I used to play while I was pregnant. And in the middle of that emotional storm, only one thing made sense: to pray. My prayer wasn't eloquent or filled with perfect words. It was a trembling whisper. Take care of her for me, Lord. It was my first conscious act of faith, a raw, unfiltered cry, born from the purest kind of pain. I walked out of that room with an emptiness that felt endless, like half of me had been left behind, in a crib that would never be mine again. For days, I slept with my arms crossed over my chest as if I was still trying to hold her. And without even realizing it, that's when the rebuilding began. God didn't give my daughter back to me that day, but He started restoring something inside me, something that, over time, would prepare me for what was coming next, including the name I would keep whispering in secret. Even after she was gone, I never stopped calling her Callie. It was the name I whispered when I woke up in the middle of the night, the name that slipped between the lines of my prayers, even when my faith felt shattered. I knew her adoptive parents probably gave her a different name, but deep inside, she was always Callie to me. Holding on to that name felt like the last way I had to not lose her completely. It was personal, sacred, and somehow my secret way of keeping a quiet testimony of faith alive in my heart. During those years when silence and longing walked hand in hand, saying her name felt like lighting a candle in the dark. Sometimes I'd say it out loud while driving alone, just to remind myself she was real, that she existed, that a part of me was out there somewhere with a different last name. There were moments I'd see a little girl on the street and my heart would skip a beat. For a second, I thought it might be her, but it never was, and the name would quietly return to its hiding place inside me. Callie was the prayer that never aged, even when I stopped believing in promises. Even when my Bible sat closed for months, her name would still leave my lips with reverence. And now, looking back, I realize that invisible thread is what kept me alive. Because when you love that deeply, not time, not distance, not silence can erase it. But loving like that comes at a high price. And that price started to show when I tried to move on, pretending I was okay.
You know that kind of pain you learn to hide so well that even you start to believe you've moved on? That was me. I got up every day, went to work, made new friends, even tried a few relationships. On the outside, everything seemed reasonably normal. But on the inside, it felt like living with a locked door in my heart. I smiled in pictures, then came home and stared at the ceiling like I was waiting for a miracle that never came. Overcoming with God still felt like a distant concept. I was just surviving. I tried so many distractions, binge-watched shows, threw myself into work, visited new coffee shops, like changing locations could somehow change the pain. But Callie's absence was always there, hidden in the little things, in the lingering memory of baby powder, in the old songs that made me cry for no reason. It was a silent grief. No one around me remembered. Only I knew someone was missing. And in trying to move on without facing the past, I started losing something even more precious, my faith. There was a season where I avoided anything that mentioned God. You know that feeling of, if he really cared, this wouldn't have happened? Yeah, I didn't want to admit it, but I was angry. Not just for giving up my daughter, but for feeling like it had all been for nothing, like God didn't do anything with my sacrifice. That part's hard to say out loud, but it's real. Because before we live a testimony of faith, sometimes we have to walk through a deep crisis with God, and mine was just beginning.
My body started showing signs before my soul was ready to admit it. Constant migraines, unexplained exhaustion, anxiety attacks that came out of nowhere, all of it was just a reflection of something much deeper. My faith was sick, and so was I. I knew where my Bible was, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. I knew how to pray, but my mouth stayed silent. It felt like after everything I had been through, God had become a stranger. And the worst part, I convinced myself he was punishing me and that I deserved it. When you start drifting away from your faith, it doesn't happen all at once. It's subtle. First, you stop praying before bed. Then you stop listening to worship music. And before you know it, Sunday feels like any other day. I was living in a state of numbness, like I was emotionally shut down. Nothing made sense anymore, not even the things that used to bring me joy. And yet, deep down, there was still a tiny bit of hope, a flicker, because even though my faith was sick, the seed hadn't died. What no one told me, and maybe what you need to hear right now, is that even faith can go through sickness, and that's okay. God doesn't pull away when we're weak. He draws closer. That's when I began to realize my story of overcoming with God wasn't over. It was just being refined in the dark. But to step back into the light, I was going to need help. And that's when an old friendship became the outstretched hand I didn't even know I needed. Nicole was the kind of friend you don't fully appreciate until you realize how essential she really is. While the rest of the world let me sink, she stayed. No pressure, no judgment, no expectations. She just stayed. She'd send short texts, show up with coffee on random days, and always found a way to mention God, even when I changed the subject. And honestly, that quiet kind of persistence is what kept me breathing.
Because every story of overcoming with God needs someone who refuses to give up on you. I remember one day in particular, I was at rock bottom. Messy hair, swollen eyes, the apartment, a disaster. And she showed up with a grocery bag and a smile. She made soup, listened to me, and before she left, she said, "You're going to share this testimony of faith with a lot of people someday. You know that." I laughed, sarcastically, but deep down, something sparked. It felt like God was using her voice to whisper that He was still writing my story, even when I thought the page had already turned. Nicole never pushed me back to church. She pulled me back with love. And that love reminded me of something I had forgotten, that the gospel is, above all else, about grace. Not about earning it, not about performing, grace. And it was that very grace shown through simple acts of friendship that began to heal me. But there was still one more step, and she's the one who led me to it without even realizing it. The day I finally said yes to an invitation that had been waiting for months. It was on a cloudy Sunday that I finally gave in to Nicole's invitation. I didn't go because I felt ready. I went because I was tired of feeling lost. I walked into the church like someone sneaking into a house where they no longer belonged. I sat in the very last row, head down, heart heavy. People were smiling, singing. They looked so light. And there I was, just trying not to cry. But it was during that service, led by Pastor Nolan, that something inside me finally broke and started being rebuilt by invisible hands. It was my moment of reconnecting with God. The pastor didn't shout, didn't use fancy words, but every sentence felt like it had been written just for me. He talked about the God who sees the invisible, the God who knows the name of your tears. I cried like a child, and I couldn't even explain why. It was like all the layers I'd built up over the years were being peeled away one by one. It wasn't magical. It was real. The kind of healing that starts in the quiet without any big signs. That day, I realized that faith can fall asleep, but it doesn't die. And God, He never stops reaching for us. I walked out of that service without all the answers, but with a spark of hope I hadn't felt in years. I started going back on the Sundays that followed, one day at a time, no rush. I felt like someone learning how to walk again. God didn't restore me all at once. He touched me piece by piece. And the more I returned, the more I realized that place wasn't just a church. It was a spiritual workshop. And in that workshop, I slowly started bringing in all the pain I'd kept hidden, even the letters I never had the courage to send. At the back of my closet, there was an old shoebox wrapped in faded gift paper. Inside, I kept all the letters I had written to my daughter, one for each year, always on her birthday. I didn't know where she was. I didn't know if she'd ever read those words. But still, I wrote. It became a sacred ritual. I'd tell her about my life, about what I was going through, about how I still prayed for her. It was my way of staying her mom, even from a distance. It was the most intimate expression of my faith. Each letter was written through tears. Some were long, filled with confessions and longing. Others were short, just an "I love you" and a Bible verse. But they all had one thing in common, the hope that one day, somehow, God would build a bridge between us. I would fold the paper gently, slip it into an envelope, and place it in the box like I was building a secret memorial between me and heaven. And the most beautiful part? Even without answers, I never stopped praying, not even when my faith was bruised. I know maybe you have things you never said, feelings you've swallowed, prayers you've whispered that feel like they went nowhere. But let me tell you something. God heard every single one, every word, every sigh. And he saw those letters too, not with human eyes, but with the eyes of a father. And that's exactly why, years later, in the most unexpected moment, a simple notification on my phone carried the answer I never thought I'd receive. It was an ordinary morning, one of those days when you're not expecting anything special. I picked up my phone like I always do and saw a message notification on a social media app I barely used anymore. When I opened it, time stood still. "Hi, my name is Callie Monroe. I think you might be my mom?" My heart started racing in a way I can't even describe. I read it over and over, maybe 10 times. My hands were shaking. It felt like 20 years of silence had been shattered by a single sentence. And in that moment, I knew God had never forgotten my testimony of faith. It took me a while to find the words to reply. Everything I typed felt too small compared to the flood of emotions that hit me. I sat on the couch, took a deep breath, and cried. But it wasn't just sadness. It was relief. It was gratitude. It was fear, too. And I realized that no matter how much time had passed, she was still calling me. Not with her voice, but with her soul. And that name I had kept hidden in my heart for so many years was now right there, at the end of a message. Callie Monroe. I took a deep breath, wiped my face, and wrote back, "Yes, I am. And I've waited my whole life for this moment." There were no speeches, no long explanations at first, just the confirmation of a bond that had never truly been broken. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't know if she wanted to see me, if she was just curious, or if this would be the beginning or the end. But one thing I did know, God had started something, and I needed to be ready for whatever he was about to reveal in the hours ahead. We met at a small, quiet coffee shop in the heart of Kansas City. I got there early, like I always do when I'm nervous. Every minute felt like an eternity. And when she walked in, my world stopped. I recognized her instantly. Not by her features, but by her spirit. It was her, my Callie, the little girl I had rocked in my dreams, the one I had called by name in prayer, was now walking toward me with a shy smile and eyes that said everything. She was the fulfillment of an old promise, one made through tears and carried by faith. The words didn't come right away. We just looked at each other for a few seconds. I wanted to stand up, run, hug her, but I froze. She sat across from me and smiled. "I didn't know what you looked like, but I dreamed of this moment so many times." Her voice was sweet, steady, and somehow deeply familiar. And there I was, speechless, just silently thanking God for allowing that moment to happen. It felt like heaven had stitched that meeting together with invisible threads. It was the kind of God-given restoration you can only understand when you've lived it. We talked for hours about everything, about nothing, about the life we had lived apart and the strange, unspoken connection that still remained. We shared stories, questions, quiet moments. She didn't come with blame, and I didn't come with excuses. It was just heart to heart. Sitting at that coffee shop table, I realized that some promises from God aren't lost in time. They're just waiting for the right time. And what she told me at the end of that meeting was what surprised me the most. Callie told me that just days before reaching out, she had prayed and asked God for a sign. She said she was carrying questions, silent pain, and a fragile hope that somehow still lived inside her. And during that reunion, there, between a cup of coffee and tearful glances, she pulled a small Bible out of her bag. It was worn, underlined, its pages stained with old tears. She placed it on the table and said, "It was through this that I found peace, and it was through this that I realized there was love even in your absence." My heart broke in silence. It was God's grace embracing me through the daughter I had once surrendered. She told me she was raised in a loving home, but always felt a missing piece.
even with amazing adoptive parents. She wanted to understand where she came from. She said she never hated me. On the contrary, she always believed there was a greater purpose behind my decision. And when she found faith, she also found a way to forgive, before even knowing who I was. I always knew there had to be love behind what you did, and now, seeing you here, I'm sure of it. Hearing that felt like heaven had written a psalm just for me, the kind of faith testimony that heals old wounds with new words. We hugged. For the first time in 20 years, I felt her touch, and it was as if time had looped back, like God was saying, I was here the whole time. She didn't want answers. She didn't need explanations. She just wanted to be close. And with that Bible in her hands and that love in her eyes, Callie showed me what true forgiveness looks like, what restoration looks like, what grace really is. In that moment, I understood I hadn't been rejected by God. I hadn't been forgotten. I was being refined, prepared for a reunion that had more to do with heaven than with the past.
The days that followed our reunion were full of emotion, but also full of caution. The joy was overwhelming, but the lost time still echoed in silence and unanswered questions. Callie and I took it slow. Short messages, long phone calls, quiet meetups. Every step was an act of rebuilding. She needed space, and I needed patience. There was no manual for healing 20 years of distance, but there was prayer. And that's what guided us, kneeling in different corners of the city, crying out to God with the same prayer. Teach us how to be mother and daughter, even after everything. We spent months having honest conversations. Sometimes we got emotional, talking about simple things, like our favorite songs, verses, or even coffee flavors. Other times, silence would show up, and we learned to honor it. She told me about her teenage years, her dreams, and how certain special dates always felt incomplete. I shared my failures, the broken attempts to move on, and the letters I wrote her every year on her birthday. Every line in those letters was a hidden prayer, and when Callie read some of them, she cried. She said she felt loved, even without growing up with me. It was like God had sewn our hearts together from the inside, even when we were apart. Faith gave us the right rhythm. Little by little, we built a relationship not based on the past, but on what God was doing in the present. We started praying together, short prayers, messages with verses, meetups where the Bible sat between us. That's how we moved from emotional survivors to spiritual companions, from two women marked by pain to two souls healed by the same grace. The rebuilding wasn't easy, but it was real. It was honest. And the most beautiful part, it happened in God's perfect time. Callie asked me if I'd be willing to meet the parents who raised her. My heart tightened, not out of jealousy, but out of deep reverence. Linda and Brandon Holloway were God's instruments in giving my daughter everything I couldn't offer at the time, and I wanted to thank them. We arranged to meet on a Sunday afternoon at a warm and humble home where smiles spoke louder than any awkwardness. When I saw Linda for the first time, I felt something I can't explain. There was a mix of tenderness and respect in her eyes. She approached gently, held my hands, and said, she always knew she was loved twice, by us and by you. Brandon, quieter and more reserved, came next. His teary eyes said what words couldn't. He didn't treat me with coldness, nor with pride. He looked at me like a father who understood both the weight and the honor of caring for such a precious gift. We all sat down together, Callie between us, holding our hands like she was connecting two worlds. We talked for hours. They shared stories about her first steps, her birthdays, the joys, and the struggles. And I, with tears in my eyes, thanked them for every detail. I always prayed that God would place Callie in a home full of love, and He chose you. That afternoon healed wounds I didn't even know were still bleeding. There was no competition. There was surrender. No judgment, only honor. Linda told me that Callie had always had a heart turned toward God, and that when she decided to find me, they supported her with love and prayer.
When I left that house, my heart felt lighter because I understood something. God had taken care of my daughter perfectly. He used hands that weren't mine, but were just as faithful as if they were. And I went home in peace, knowing that the prayer I whispered 20 years ago had been answered with the kind of details only heaven could orchestrate. For a long time, I lived just trying to survive the guilt, the pain, the silence, survive the absence of my daughter, and the voices inside me that kept saying I wasn't worthy of love or a fresh start. But after that reunion with Callie, with her family, and most of all, with God, something inside me changed. It wasn't just relief. It was a new mission. I began to understand that my past didn't have to be a burden anymore. It could become a testimony. I started sharing my story quietly at small women's gatherings at church, and every time I spoke, someone cried. Someone related. Someone said, "You just told my story." It was Pastor Nolan who encouraged me to do it more often. He said God turns pain into purpose, and maybe this was my purpose now, to help other women who were still silent, like I had been for so long. It wasn't easy. I still shook when I spoke. I still got emotional every time I remembered. But something supernatural would happen. Each time I shared my testimony, a part of my heart was restored. And more than that, other people were being healed too. It was like God was using every broken piece of my story to rebuild someone else's. I went from survivor to witness, not because everything turned out perfectly, but because God's grace covered every imperfection. Today, every time I share what I've been through, it's not to relive the pain, but to reveal the God who was with me the whole time. A God who writes with tears, heals with time, and reconciles with love. And when I see Callie sitting in church, joining the women's meetings, sometimes even praying over other girls, I understand what was once a hidden scar has become a seed of hope planted in many hearts.
It was 20 years of silence, whispered prayers, and tears that fell on my pillow when no one was watching. There were nights I wondered if God had forgotten me, if my prayers had been swallowed up by time, if the little girl I loved in secret would ever know that she was never abandoned in my heart. But today, looking back on everything I've lived through, I know this: God never forgot my tears. Every single one was kept by him, like seeds of a miracle that would bloom at just the right time. And he did more than I ever imagined. He didn't just bring my daughter back. He gave me the chance to rebuild, to start over, to testify. Callie and I have our differences, our own scars and lessons, but the love that connects us now is watered by something deeper than blood. It's watered by grace, by the choice to forgive, to understand, to walk side by side. Today, she knows she was loved from the womb, and I know I didn't fail. I obeyed even when it hurt, and God honored every step, every sacrifice, every silent prayer. If you asked me today if it was worth the wait, I'd say yes, because waiting on God is never in vain. My story isn't about loss, it's about redemption. It's about a God who takes our most painful chapters and turns them into pages filled with hope. If you're holding on to old tears, remember, God doesn't forget. He writes with every single one. He heals in his perfect time. And when the promise finally arrives, it comes complete with details only heaven could have written. Today, Callie and I walk side by side, not as strangers trying to reconnect, but as two women who've learned that God's love is the strongest bond there is.
If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that God never wastes a single tear. If he could restore my story after 20 years of silence, what couldn't he do for you? So tell me, what have you been carrying inside for so long? What pain are you hiding behind your smile?
What prayer did you stop praying because you thought it was too late? I challenge you, don't give up. Because as long as there's life, there's still time. And as long as there's faith, there's still hope. The same God who gave me a reunion can give you a brand new beginning. If this story touched your heart, I want to invite you to be part of this community of faith and fresh starts. Subscribe to the Faith Story channel because every video we share is a reminder that God is still writing incredible stories like mine and like yours. Here, I found a place to share my journey, and maybe now it's your turn. Your pain can become a testimony. Your past can inspire someone. So share with us in the comments, what moment in your life made you realize God was listening, even in the silence? Let's fill the comments with stories that glorify God. And remember, you are not alone. There are still blank pages being prepared just for you.